Ask Mr. Sal. This episode is about the Vietnam conflict. This is part 4 of this series on Vietnam and the Vietnam conflict. We're going to cover President Ford through hopefully the key terms. Not quite sure if we're going to get through everything, if there'll be a part 5 or not. So that's what the question mark's for. We're hoping to get through the key terms and all the other fun stuff. We'll see. So we're doing part 4, President Ford forward, and it's a drizzly / rainy Friday morning actually here in Elwood City. So we're going to jump ahead and get into the Vietnam conflict. We've covered all of these areas. It's loading. We're in the Ford years. Now, we have to understand with President Ford, he was the House Minority Leader. He ascended to the presidency to vice presidency when Spiro Agnew, Nixon's vice president, resigned. And then once Nixon resigned, Ford became president. So he was not elected to a national office. He was elected to the House of Representatives by a region in Michigan. So he kept all of Nixon's advisors. That's the first thing. Kept Nixon's advisors in play. He takes over at the tail end of the Vietnam War. One of the first things he does is anyone who did not serve in the military because of the draft, they dodged the draft, evaded the draft, however you want to state it. He offered them clemency, which is a forgiveness. Okay, and the reason for this was he wanted to reunite the nation. He wanted to move forward. And the controversies with Vietnam, the protests, the riots, the pro-war protests that were dividing the nation. Watergate divided the nation even further. He wanted to move forward, did not want to go backwards. At this point in time, Vietnam erupts in violence. North Vietnam did some minor attacks, and when the United States didn't respond, they acted more aggressively. The United States did offer humanitarian aid, but would not send troops. And at that point, the humanitarian aid was not enough. April 1975, South Vietnam falls to the communists. Also, in that time, Laos and Cambodia also fall to communist insurgents and become communist countries. Some of you asked in your questions about the domino theory. Is it legit? Is it not? In this case, it was. You had Vietnam falling to communism, and then Laos and Cambodia also fall to communism. We'll talk about what the type of governments they have now as we move forward. Those are questions you guys had. So this wraps up Ford's efforts in Vietnam. Ford did pardon Nixon about 6 weeks after the president resigned. Became former President Nixon. Ford pardoned him for any crimes he may have committed. This didn't sit well with the people, but Ford was trying to move forward. Casualties. I'm not going to read this to you, but I'm going to sit here and let you look over this. You can pause this on the video. And some of the questions that came up, like who else fought in this war? You have the United States, South Vietnamese forces, North Vietnamese forces. Those were the main groups fighting. The other countries that were fighting for South Vietnam, you have South Korea. They lost over 4,000 men. Thailand and Australia and New Zealand also fought to some extent, having troops in the country. So you can take a look at this. And we're going to jump to the next, the aftermath. And I'm going to pause because I have a faculty meeting. Okay, we're picking up with the aftermath of Vietnam. A lot of fallout from this. What was a war, but an undeclared war. So you have a lot of mistrust or distrust in the government that continues through today. People, if you look at what's going on with the world today, a lot of distrust in government that sprang from the events of this time, as you have, the the lies that came out about how far we were supporting the South Vietnamese government, Nixon's actions with Watergate, the other break-ins, the Pentagon Papers that came out. This had bred a lot of issues. And then even with President Ford becoming president, people thought that he was picked to be vice president because he offered, ahead of time, offered Nixon a pardon if he was going to go to jail. Taking a sip of coffee. So that comes out of this era, and it stuck with us through today. There was a loss of prestige. Vietnam's considered a loss, although I argue that we got the terms we wanted, and then once those terms were violated, we didn't step back in. But there was a loss of prestige in the world. And if I zoom in a bit here, afterwards the U.S. was hesitant to get involved in ground wars. And even to this day, the reference is made, we don't want another Vietnam, a war that's going to slog on for a long period of time. That's the argument with Afghanistan and some of the other places we've been. We don't want to put ground troops in and have them stuck there without an end to the mission in sight. A couple other incidents that came out, the War Powers Act, not an incident but a law, 1973. What happened with the War Powers Act, because troops were sent in with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution under LBJ, and then Nixon followed up with it afterwards. There was no formal declaration of war by Congress. Congress is the only one that could declare war. The House and Senate afterwards said, well, we thought this was going to be a temporary measure, and it went on for years and years. And technically we put advisors in 1950. We took over officially in 1954, 1955, and it wasn't until 1975 that we pulled our troops out of there. So the War Powers Act, president is allowed to send troops into battle for 60 days without congressional approval. Then after those 60 days, if the president does not ask Congress to declare war, the president will have another 30 days to withdraw troops from that area. So it's a 60-day window for troops, and then it follows up with another 30. So it gives you a total of 90 days to have troops in harm's way without congressional approval. Next law, big one, came out of this, the 26th Amendment, ratified in 1971. What the 26th Amendment does is it lowers the voting age for federal elections down to 18 years of age. One of the big things that came out of Vietnam was teenagers, 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, even 20-year-olds, they're out of their teens, but they are not allowed to vote for president in federal elections, national elections, yet they are being sent in harm's way by the very people who they don't have a say in electing. So the voting age was lowered. Unfortunately, you guys don't vote much, so politicians don't listen to you, but that's something that came about with the 26th Amendment in 1971. Up until that time, you had to be 21 years of age or older to vote. So, some of the other aftermath. North Vietnam takes over South Vietnam, and you have a communist government take over. Laos falls, they become communist form of government. Cambodia falls, they become a communist government. Over time, Laos and Vietnam are still communist, but the communist government in Cambodia fell, and it is now a constitutional monarchy. So, as I mentioned before, in theory, the domino theory did prove to be true. Once Vietnam fell, the communist rebels in the other countries eventually took over. Couple big issues here with the aftermath of Vietnam. There's a lot of controversy. It divided the country. And realistically, whenever I was going through high school, elementary, middle school in the 70s, And then early 80s with high school, Vietnam wasn't talked about much. It was still a sore spot, and people didn't like talking about it. A big thing, a big controversy, the soldiers that came home. After previous wars, when soldiers came home, they were treated with parades, treated as heroes. And something that I consider wrong, personal opinion on this, when many of the American soldiers came home from Vietnam, they were treated poorly. They were called names, they were spat upon, they were, just treated poorly by the people because of the American public's outlook on what was going on in Vietnam and how many people thought it was a wrong war and the divisions in the country that came about. So those are okay. Now there's differences in perspectives, and this is what comes into play. It's why it's important to know things about the world and not just be focused only on your own neighborhood. People would ask, what's the purpose of the conflict? Well, for the United States, remember the Cold War's going on. Their goal was to stop communism, stop the spread of communism. So it didn't matter, who you supported as long as they weren't a communist. We weren't necessarily for democracy. We just wanted a non-communist ruler, even if they were not the best ruler. And that came back and bit us numerous times over the history of our country and who we supported. From the Vietnamese perspective, they wanted to free their country from colonial rule. You had the French there from the 1800s. And then we took over, and many Vietnamese viewed this entire episode as we're trying to get foreigners out of our country. And to them it was a fight for freedom, where we're just trying, to stop one ideology and promote our own ideology. So this affected the war. It also affected how the United States viewed the war and why the war became negative to many people in our country. Some of the students asked, why did they choose communism? Well, it's a colonial power. So the French owned a lot of the property, and you had a small class of rich Vietnamese people that owned property, but that was it. The common people didn't own much. So when you don't have anything and people come in and offer you, hey, you have equality, you'll have equal ownership, it sounds good in theory. We've talked about this before. And that's what swayed people towards the communist concept. And some people wanted the French out, wanted the Americans out. They weren't necessarily communists, but they wanted them out because they're foreigners and they want their country back. They want to have self-rule. So that caused issues. Another issue with perspectives. Rolling Thunder. From what I've read about this, LBJ and his leaders, they decided, we're going to let the North Vietnamese save face. We're going to make our list of targets from not very important to very important. We're going to start at the bottom of the list, and we're going to bomb the Vietnamese. We're going to show them, the North Vietnamese, we're going to show them that we're serious about this, but we're going to let them save face so they can negotiate an end to this war without losing face, without being shamed. And we'll gradually move up the list. Well, the North Vietnamese took it as being weak. The concept was, they're bombing the least important targets of ours. They're not going after anything important. They're afraid of us. They're weak. They're not coming at us from a point of power. So this difference in perspective made Rolling Thunder fail miserably. And one thing to understand, we get into, if you look back at the casualty list, we, numbers-wise, we killed way more of their soldiers than they did of ours. Any death is a major death, especially if it's someone that a friend of yours, family, anything along those lines. So I'm not minimizing that, but if you look at the numbers, we did more damage, and Vietnam was decimated from the bombing, the napalm, which we'll talk about, the Agent Orange, things of that nature. Another question came up when talking about perspectives. With communism, who were their allies? China gave a little bit of help, but China and Vietnam historically didn't get along. Russia was one of the countries that supplied the North Vietnamese, and that was something we were trying to avoid, was to bring them into the war directly, much like what happened in Korea when we brought the Chinese into the war. So the overall concept, this is part of the Cold War. We're trying to contain communism, continue the Cold War, war by proxy, but we got drawn in with the ground forces because the South Vietnamese, we didn't back a strong leader, we didn't back a good leader, they were corrupt, and they didn't fight well, so we had to put our own troops on the ground. As we move ahead to the next slide here, as I zoom out, the key leaders. So the United States presidents, from Truman all the way down to President Ford, the last president that pulled troops out. In North Vietnam, the two big leaders, Ho Chi Minh and General Giap, and I'm not saying his name right, I forget exactly how to pronounce his name. Those are the two notable leaders you should know. There's other leaders and other people involved. We're not going to get into that right now. With South Vietnam, we had President Diem, who was assassinated by his own forces with approval from the United States because he was not leading well. It was causing more problems. And then President Thu, I'm not sure if I'm saying his name, he was one of the last presidents, not the last, but he stepped down right before South Vietnam fell to North Vietnam in 1975. He called the United States out for the loss of Vietnam, said it was our fault. And after he stepped down, I believe there were two other generals that stepped in. He was a general, one of the people that helped get rid of President Diem. After he stepped down, I believe there was a quick succession of two generals taking charge, and then within a couple of days, South Vietnam fell. Then we have, they're not presidents, but they were department secretaries. Robert McNamara, he was Secretary of Defense for both JFK and LBJ. And then Henry Kissinger, he was the Secretary of State for both Richard Nixon and President Ford, Gerald Ford. So those are the key players. And I'll get them into flashcards for you for next week. And as we move on, the last thing we're going to cover, the key terms. We talked about the domino theory. Once one country falls, the others around it will also fall. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution. That allowed the president to send troops and defend our troops in Vietnam. We've talked about the Ho Chi Minh Trail. That's how North Vietnamese supplied the troops in South Vietnam. The Tet Offensive we've covered. That was the attack on the Vietnamese New Year. Rolling Thunder we've covered. And the War Powers Act we've covered. We have 4 terms we haven't covered yet. I'm going to take a break. Okay, we're about at our recording limit, so the last couple key terms. Agent Orange. This was brought about, it's a chemical that was dropped over Vietnam it's a defoliant, I think is how you say it. Basically, it kills vegetation. They would dump it. It would kill the vegetation. It was a jungle war. You couldn't see the enemy. So we used this to kill off the vegetation so we could see what we were shooting and who we were shooting at. This was a different kind of war, so we used that. We also used napalm, which was a gelatinous, flammable liquid, like a gasoline mixture. We would drop it and would just burn things. We used that to kill people and to clear the vegetation so we could see what we were doing. The Viet Minh, they became the North Vietnamese government. They were the early fighters, and then we have the Viet Cong, who were the rebels in the south after North and South Vietnam were split. They were the communist rebels. And a question came in about the strategic Hamlet program, 1950s to 1963 under President Diem. We tried to go out into the countryside. The South Vietnamese controlled the cities. The communists controlled the countryside. We tried to build these little towns, villages, into fortresses that could defend themselves against the communists. It didn't work well after Diem was assassinated. That program ended. So that pretty much takes care of everything. That's the overview. And if you have any questions, please email me. Hope this was informative for you guys. Take care. This episode is written by us, you and me. They're your questions, my answers, thoroughly researched by several different sites as I go through and fact check from the books that I've read on Vietnam, the history books, and other websites I've used. So, hitting up different parts of research to get you the answers you are looking for.